I've got 44 countries that I'm going to put onto a tier list, so let's get into it. A lot of countries would like to be allies with the United States. People can complain about American hegemony, but at the end of the day, they're the hottest girl at the bar. And you know who knows that? Canada, America's hat. Canada has had a free trade agreement with the United States for a very long time. The new one, the USMCA, is pretty darn good for Canada. It's great. They get access to American capital markets, and it's the reason that the US actually has a trade deficit with its northern neighbor. And that's not going to change anytime soon, but they provide some degree of security. Now, if you analyze it, the Canadian border isn't exactly secure. There's not a lot of military bases up there for the United States, and it is porous. You can get stuff through there the same way they get stuff through the Mexican border. But all in all, they're part of the Five Eyes intelligence group. They're part of G7 together. Really, the biggest issue is that Canada can't really project much power onto the objectives that the United States has. The primary benefit is you have a friendly party on your northern border, and I don't really see that changing anytime soon. So we're putting Canada at the A tier. And before we get to the next one, let's just talk really quickly about what makes America such an appealing ally. Number one is its economy and its capital markets. If you can tap into American capital markets, if you can sell into American markets, you're going to do very well economically. And they have the strongest military capability. They can project force into most of the regions of the world, maybe not like Central Asia, but hey, we'll give that one up. Besides that, they also have a Navy that can guarantee free trade for American allies, which is really the only people that are going to get that guarantee from the US Navy in the future, and it's probably going to come with a price. But what does the US look for in its allies? Well, preferential trade deals is one of the big things that a good ally will have. The ability to collaborate in security. The United States has the best military, but the ability to be collaborative and integrate tightly is a big deal. And then we can't overlook location, right? If you're in a strategic location, if you help us box in an adversary or counter an adversary, which we'll talk about later with like a country like Finland that doesn't have a huge population, but they are really interesting in terms of putting pressure on Russia, that's going to make them a compelling ally. And the country that checks the most boxes, I think, of any of these is Japan, S tier. And the other thing that's really important to remember for this list, we're not talking about the past. We went to World War against Germany and Japan, and they're both going to be very high on this list. Japan being the highest, and that's the past. In the present, Japan is the number one most important ally to countering the United States' number one geopolitical rival, China. They will only switch sides if we fail to protect Taiwan and Taiwan is taken over. If Taiwan's taken over, the whole board flips, but we kind of have a joint agreement with the Japanese that we're not going to let that happen. People can pretend like that's not the case. That's what it's going to be. And one of the most interesting things that I learned recently is that the former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, was actually the person that created the concept and the term, the Indo-Pacific. For the longest time, it was just Asia or Southeast Asia or East Asia. And he reframed the geopolitical chessboard as the Indo-Pacific. And now we have in the United States Navy, leader of Indo-Pacific Command, who is responsible for kind of overseeing this region and thinking strategically there. That was Shinzo Abe coming to Donald Trump with that concept that he then, kind of took and in his way took credit for and all this other stuff. But it was Abe who had the vision and the foresight to push that initiative forward. It wasn't Obama. It wasn't an American leader. It was Abe. So that's the type of strategic thinking that's coming out of Japan. They are highly defensible. We don't have to go station a bunch of people kind of purely for the defense of Japan. We can use their string of islands to project power into the South China Sea. And then, the other thing economically is tight integration. Japan's, going off a demographic cliff. They're trying to turn that around. But that means that countries like Toyota are like de facto American companies. I know that that's like controversial and not completely right, but like their biggest manufacturing centers are in Indiana, Kentucky, Texas, Alabama. Like that's where a lot of Toyotas are made. So while it's not a in-name American car company, they're being made in the United States, which is just another thing that is indicative of strong economic ties, mutually beneficial relationship. And for the definitions of this video, we're talking about any ally. That could be someone with a mutual defense agreement, a trade agreement, or another form of major collaboration. And we may miss a few here and there, but we got all the major ones. Which brings us to Mexico, another really important partner, putting them at the A tier. It's a huge economic partnership. But the USMCA, it's really the US and Mexico that are the core of that, just in terms of economic size, population, ability to integrate into the future. We like when Canada, brings oil and other resources down, but it's just not comparable from a population standpoint. When was the Mexican-American War? 1846 to 1848. So we haven't gone to war in, 180 years, something like that. Is the border secure? No. Are the cartels largely in control? Yes. But we are in a position where we both benefit way more from collaborating than competing. There's not a strong impetus. Mexico, really benefits from the fact that they have no external risk of invasion. They don't have to invest a ton into their security or be super worried about their security because of the fact that they're neighbors and, their waters are de facto patrolled by the US Navy, but we're not going to necessarily go invade them. We don't want that land. It's not particularly valuable to us. We already took what we wanted. A tier for Mexico. Another A tier one, and this one might be surprising, is Poland. They share a border with both Russia and Belarus. And one of the key considerations we're always going to be here is, are they actually useful in countering the United States geopolitical rivals? And they're investing billions into their military. We're going to talk later about the NATO standard of a 2% of GDP being allocated towards military. Poland's more like 4%. Like, they are not meeting some baseline. They are investing for their own self-defense. That's why they're doing it. But that means that our goals are highly aligned with theirs. If Poland is attacked, we are going to support them probably even more than we would support Ukraine, for the basis of them also being in NATO. From them actually actively buying from the US defense primes, not just receiving allocations of resources, paid for by the government. And so, this has been the staging ground for the battle in Ukraine. Russia ain't gonna be done after they take whatever slice of Ukraine they end up with. And so this is one of those next flashpoints. They don't ask for much. They're basically asking for hey, we're in NATO, we're pulling our part as it pertains to that. We would be a major, major domino to fall. So back us up, and we're down to do that. So let's go on to Brazil. Some people might say that Brazil is an ally. I'm putting them at the bottom of D tier. First of all, they're in BRICS, active participants in BRICS. They're buddies with China and Russia. China is their number one trading partner. And Lulu, the current leader, is, talking about unseating the US dollar as the world reserve currency. Now, luckily, the other members of BRICS, we've done a whole video about this, aren't actually on board to make that happen. But he's actively we should do that. We should get out from, under the US dollar as a reserve currency standard. Bolsonaro was kind of trying to swing back and pivot more towards the other bloc. If you think of one bloc as kind of the Iran, Russia, China bloc, and then the other bloc that's more like the G7 countries, he was trying to swing more in that direction, and the pendulum's going back. So they are not, I wouldn't even call them an ally, but they're not a good ally to us if you wanted to put them in some sort of tier ranking. Which brings us to another B country, Bulgaria. Bulgaria is also D tier, despite the fact that they're in NATO, and they are one of the quintessential examples of a country that has been under the intended NATO military spending threshold of 2% for years. They're at 1.8% now. They have been ramping it up. But as you look at the future of a Ukraine conflict or more conflict in Eastern Europe, at purchasing power parity, Russia is spending about $370 billion on its military. And if you were to take the European NATO countries at their military spending, it's about $380 billion. And so, when we think about what can actually move the needle here, all of the NATO countries, and for a while it's been a majority of them, and they're trying to catch up, but they're not there yet. They have a $90 billion GDP. They should be spending about $1.8 billion a year on their military. People say that doesn't really move the needle. That's like a fart in the wind compared to, Germany's military potential buildup or some of these other large economies. Yes, sure. But you are a small state that is expecting to be protected. And this is going to sound very much like a Trumpian argument, but I think that this is, relatively common sense for folks that don't want to forward deploy Americans to defend Eastern European countries that they couldn't even probably pick out on a map. And so if you want that security guarantee, you have to at least represent that you're pulling your weight. I think that's going to be the case regardless of a Biden re-election or a Trump election at the end of 2024, but they just need to ramp it up. The same is true with Belgium. Bottom tier military spend, really, really actually weak, 1.10%, 1.13%, depending on your resources there. They've got great waffles. They're just bad allies. They're not really doing much other than hosting a few nukes for the United States. And there's a number of these NATO countries that have been below 2% for years. And there's an estimate, assuming that every other event of history stayed the same, if you had just had from the Cold War, when all these countries massively ramped down their spending, if they had just kept it up, there would be a $600 billion stockpile of weapons, munitions, other military equipment that could be used in this Ukraine conflict to bolster the other countries that are sharing that border with Russia and our invasion risks in the future. That would be a massive, massive deterrent. And basic, military strategy is, there's two ways to think about it. One is to build up to go to war. And the other buildup that you do is to prevent war. And the calculation that someone makes is, hey, I think I can go take that land at an acceptable price, an acceptable cost. I guarantee Putin's calculus would have been different if there was a $600 billion stockpile, and Belgium is one of the countries responsible for that shortcoming. D tier. France is one of the tricky ones. They've got nukes. They would be one of the countries that's like deploying nukes in an Armageddon scenario in favor of us. They're not launching them across the Atlantic. They're launching them, towards Russia if that were to end up occurring. They're squirrely, man. Those bureaucrats, those French diplomats, they are 2-3 moves ahead. You can't completely trust them, but you know that they're one of the independent NATO allies that has like actual economic, cultural, military might. Macron's giving speeches now about how the EU has to step up and meet the threat that is Russia, because they are aware of this kind of calculation that I've articulated that the US is making. And that's important. They're ramping up their own spending. They're modernizing. And the other thing, unfortunately, is we need Airbus to provide a lot of planes, because Boeings are falling out of the sky. I don't know if you've been seeing that, but they're a good ally. They're an ally that we should continue to cultivate. And hopefully they're able to be a part of that balancing act in Europe, so that the US could be freed to play more of a balancing role in the Indo-Pacific. I'm going to put them at A tier. One of the countries we need in the Indo-Pacific is South Korea. They have really geographically important geography. They are, I would say, less capable than Japan in terms of projecting power and actual military might. They are facing an all-time demographic bomb. They could easily fall in the tier list in the next couple decades if they don't turn their, baby drought around, which I don't even know if that's possible anymore. But there's a ton of military bases there, a ton of, joint defense commitments. And, the other thing that they do, if you're trying to understand like your own thoughts about Korea, is they project soft power particularly well. If you think about the countries like France that have this ability to just push from like a cultural basis to greater relevance worldwide, I would put like France and South Korea actually really like at the top of the heap. It's hard for me to even come up with like a comparable third country. And, that's partially what K-pop is. Yes, it's incredibly beneficial to have BTS and these other things, but when you think in forms of hard and soft power, like every American knowing BTS, it's not every American, but like a bunch of Americans knowing BTS is a form of Korean soft power that basically every other country would want, they would desire. I'm going to put them at B tier just because I don't think they have that same power projection, but they do have the defense budget. South Korean military equipment is one of the things that is being shipped, over to Ukraine as part of the support for them there. So they do have, the ability to produce some powerful military equipment. Samsung obviously is a big part of that. So B tier. Albania is D tier. Similar thing with other NATO countries. They're not spending enough on defense. And I'm curious, let me know in the comments, what do you think is a bigger soft power coup? BTS or Dua Lipa? Dua Lipa is Albanian. Who do you think more men would go to war for? Croatia, D tier, beautiful beaches, spend more on your military. I want to visit Croatia. Czech Republic, same thing. They actually have a $290 billion GDP. Like they could really move the needle by getting up to the 2% threshold, which would be $5.8 billion a year. Geographically, like they would be one of the ones that would be, forward deploying and in the sight lines there of the Eastern Front. Shucks, they need to get to it now. I'm putting Denmark D tier as well. $400 billion at GDP, and it dropped as low as 1.1% of military spending back in 2015. That's right before Trump was elected. And, he was the one who really kind of rattled the cage here that NATO allies needed to get serious. And they have been ramping up, but they're still only at 1.65%, easily $8 billion military budget if they were to get up to that 2% number. Not to mention all the retroactive stockpiles that we're missing currently. Cooperative, but they just need to ramp it up. Estonia, C tier. Now you're going to say, Aaron, this is not that big of a country, 1.3 million people. But geographically, incredibly important. Actively building fortifications to slow a invasion from Russia. They have all the scars and the history of being a part of the Soviet Union, and they don't want to be. Like, they actually are committed. They have been committed. They have maintained military conscription as a part of their military doctrine for decades. Like, that's just a part of being an Estonian. And so they are acting accordingly. They see the risk of Russia. They don't want it. And while they don't necessarily have a huge ability to be a domino falling one way or the other, they are, one of the high risk areas that's actually taking the risk seriously. Which brings us to Israel. This is going to be the most controversial part of the video for sure. During the United States maneuvers in Iraq and Afghanistan, Israel was really important. It was basically, as Robert F. Kennedy has said, an aircraft carrier that couldn't be sunk on the western end of the Middle East that could collect U.S. troops and help them deploy forward in addition to our aircraft carriers. And these days it's a huge public relations issue, particularly for Biden and folks on the left. But it's controversial because of the active conflict that's going on there. But if we were to just step back and think about what are America's highest relevance geopolitical rivals, people often say, well, it's China, Russia, and Iran. But Iran is like a distant third compared to the other two. And that's because the Middle East, as a portion of global GDP, is less than 5%. If you were to highlight the areas of strategic importance to the United States, you would go North America 1, obviously, then Asia, because of the economic might and significance that comes out of there. That can be translated into a genuine global military superpower if it's concentrated, if it's focused. Then, after Asia, you would go to Europe, simply for the proximity to the United States, a lot of, very, very well-established, long-standing allies there, in addition to the generally higher economic power. The reason that the Middle East has been such a problem for the United States is it's a quagmire. You get in there, you can't leave, you can't fix anything, and there isn't much of a reward for leaving. In the past, we needed the oil from there for ourselves and for our allies, but with the shale revolution, that's not even relevant anymore. So from an overall standpoint of like how important is Israel, they're not going to project power or kind of do anything to Russia or China if we need them to. What we really need is them to establish a relationship with Saudi Arabia that's a little more solid and create a balancing act in the Middle East so that we can leave, so that there isn't one hegemon of the Middle East. They all kind of balance each other out. If that's Turkey, Iran, and then Israel, Saudi Arabia as a three-legged stool balancing each other out, that's the ideal scenario. If we can, push them in that direction or make sure that it happens, fantastic. But, they have an elite intelligence organization. They're not part of the Five Eyes. That you could argue that Mossad is as active, against or on U.S. citizens, like trying to create influence there as they are in other regions of the world. And we know that they're very good at that. So I'm going to put them at B tier. I'm, hesitant. You could potentially even downgrade that from here. But I don't buy into the arguments of an A tier or higher ally, just given the relative unimportance of the Middle East to U.S. interests. If you disagree, you can let me know in the comments. Saudi Arabia ties into that. MBS is, working towards aligning with Israel. He understands that there's a kind of natural collaboration there. They collaborate against Iran. I think that there's plenty there to just balance one another. We do not need to get involved. But, they still sell oil to China. They're still in OPEC with Russia, and that's a perfectly, tight allyship there. But they need to counterbalance Iran in the Middle East. And, besides that, ideally for us, this is France's problem. This is China's problem. This is India's problem. This is not an American problem. For that reason, we're putting Saudi Arabia C tier. Turkey, same thing. Huge standing army. Biggest standing army outside of the United States in all of NATO. They're the biggest one in Europe. And they can counter both Iran and Russia if they choose to. But what they really do is they kind of play both sides. They're in the middle of everything, trying to create as many kind of positive connections as possible. They're not going to ever be particularly adversarial, partially just because of their geography. And they're just this huge, huge wild card there. And the most advanced economy in the Middle East, if there was going to be a hegemon for the Middle East, I think it's Turkey. I don't think it's Iran. I don't think it's Saudi Arabia. It definitely isn't Israel. So, it's great when they set up a munitions factory in Texas to produce 155 millimeter artillery shells. But, they could also be a threat to Israel. And that's like another thing that we could get pulled into, Turkey versus Israel. that we just don't want to get involved with. So I'm also going to put them on the B tier, because if they wanted to get really aligned with the US and our kind of trade was like, hey, you can go dominate the Middle East, you help us accomplish our objectives up in Europe, that would be great for us. Like detach from Russia in every way possible, help to counter them in the Black Sea, and then go do what you want with the Middle East. I think that's a win-win. We go to Italy now. I'll put them at B tier. They're another one that's been below the necessary defense budget. It's incredibly indebted. Pensions are underfunded. Amazing tourist destination. It's part of the G7, all that good stuff. But the US has a trade deficit. Like, I'm not really sure how much we're getting there, hosting some nukes, maybe some counterbalancing in the Med relative to Turkey and other powers there. I don't know. You leave me lukewarm, Italy, although I love your food. Sweden, I'm going to put them at B tier. They haven't been spending enough on their military, but that is definitely ramping up. And they're a new member to NATO, so they didn't have this obligation for 30 years to spend and just didn't meet that. They're ramping up. They see the risk and they are getting involved. And it's their Navy that would basically be patrolling the Baltic Sea in a kind of more substantial war with Russia scenario. That would be important for protecting the Baltic states like Estonia, and their island, Gotland, similar to Israel in the Middle East, is that unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Baltic Sea that could be a staging point for warplanes and other such resources. And I'm glad they're joining NATO. Australia, we're going to put at B tier. Huge geostrategic importance relative to the Indo-Pacific. Another entity that is focused on, counterbalancing China. They're in Quad with us. They're in the Five Eyes intelligence network, and they're buying submarines from us and not from France, which is great. We love that. But it's kind of small. Like the population isn't actually that large, and economically they are very reliant on mining and extracting their resources and sending it up to China. So it's not one of those instances where they just are, 110% aligned with the United States. Like they do kind of have to play ball there to some degree. And then Germany. Germany has the biggest European base that is shared with the US, but they also have a huge trade partnership with China. They probably wouldn't particularly get involved or support that much in a Taiwan scenario. That's why they wouldn't be S tier. But they just put together a $100 billion special military fund for the EU. They're taking center stage in countering Russia. They're going to forward deploy a brigade into Lithuania by 2027. So in terms of the US being able to step back from a focus on Europe and allow these EU countries to step up, Germany is one of the central parties there. So we're going to put them at A tier. There's always room for more, but overall, this is one of our key partners that we need to continue to nurture. The Netherlands, they host some nukes for us. They have low military spend, and there's a good economy there, but they could be spending more. So we're going to put them at C tier. Finland, I love Finland. B tier, not quite A tier just because of a lack of size and scale, but they share an 830-mile border with Russia. And so in a scenario where Russia's aggression is expanding into other NATO countries, they now have this whole other area that they have to worry about. Another new NATO member that has had high military spending is going to continue to ramp it. And people are like, no, they're joining. That means we have to protect them. They might not need that much protection. Back in 1939, there's the Winter War between Russia and Finland. And Finland repelled Soviet aggression, and it has a history of this. This is well baked in. They know that this is the border that they need to worry about. They're well connected to all the Nordic countries, that they're not concerned about that. They know where their bread is buttered. They know what the risk is. It gets insanely cold in northern Finland, which is just the type of fighting I would never, ever want to be a part of. But they have, great military capability for a relatively small force there. And it's just another point where pressure can be applied. Russia, would have to ideally just spread their resources thin across multiple fronts. And that's what would, benefit NATO in a scenario like this. So I'm a huge fan of Finland. Greece, not so much. Similar to Italy, they have their own debt crisis. They spend on their defense budget, but they're not even worried about NATO objectives. They're mostly worried about Turkey. They're mostly worried about Turkey as a competitor and their issues in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. Another nice place to visit, a nice tourist attraction, but strategically, I'm not sure we're getting a lot done there. C tier for Greece. Hungary, same thing. They have good military spend. I'm interested in how fertility rates are impacted by all their kind of programs that Orban's putting there, but not necessarily really moving the needle here. And it suggested a little bit from a nationalism standpoint that they wouldn't be involved in acting on Article 5 of NATO. So don't love that. C tier for Hungary. Iceland, you're useless. E tier. Lithuania, C tier, similar to Estonia, very close to Russia. And there's this place on the map, Kaliningrad, which is this additional outpost of under Russian control. And the kind of logical next move post-Ukraine is that they would try to push through Belarus, connect to Kaliningrad, and then that would be the basis for them to both attack southward into Poland and also attack northward into the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And so Lithuania, we talked about, Germans for deploying there. This is one of the ways that you keep pressure on Russia. They couldn't simply go down into Poland. They would immediately, hopefully experience pressure from Lithuania on Kaliningrad if that were to take place. They've also maintained conscription. They're aware of the risk here. They're over the 2% mark, ramping up to 3%. So they're doing their part for being a relatively small country. Latvia, same thing. They're reintroducing conscription, but they're strategically located and ramping their military spend as well. Latvia, C tier. Luxembourg, D tier. Come on. Super small population, very high GDP per capita. And that's been their complaint, right? They're one of the lowest, 0.7% defense budget, not even spending 1% of GDP on defense. And they're like, well, our GDP per capita is so high. I don't care. If you want the NATO guarantee of protection, you need to act accordingly. If Russia's expansion is effective, that is going to affect you. You got to pay up and contribute. Buy some artillery, send some stuff to the front. 0.7% is not acceptable. North Macedonia, D tier, under 2%, but you want NATO protection, barf, come on. Montenegro, D tier. Close to 2%, ramping up, small, relatively new NATO member, there's just not a lot there. United Kingdom, they're gonna get the only other S tier from me. And now that Brexit has occurred, they're United States' little bro. Our navies are completely built to be integrated. We have a trade deal with one another. We have the special relationship. We have the Five Eyes intelligence. Like, we're as thick as thieves. We're in this together. And, I honestly think that we could see ourselves as even more integrated in the future. They're at the 2% mark for military spending. If people want to say economy isn't as strong as it could be, that's fine. We can work that out. They are aligned with us, and that's a really valuable thing. Norway, we're putting it B tier. From a NATO perspective, they have, huge strategic importance in the Arctic and North Atlantic. So Russia has these two northern ports. Basically, Norway is the country where we would project power against those northern ports of Russia, which is just another potential vector for countering Russia in Europe. They're essential there. Portugal, D tier, weak military spending, get it together. Romania, C tier, solid population, they're spending on defense, and they're really key to countering Russia in Eastern Europe. Slovakia is a risky one. You could say C tier, you could say D tier. They are meeting the defense budget, but they have a leader similar to Orban that's kind of indicated that they wouldn't step up and act on Article 5 of NATO, which is basically this mutual defense kind of agreement. And so, from a geostrategic standpoint, from the fact that they actually do have military capabilities, that's, not what you want to hear. We need them to be able to step up. And so C tier, D tier, where do we think? I'm going to go with D tier, just off of them not having that complete commitment. Slovenia, super low military spend, get it up to 2%. We need to shout out all these countries that are actually not pulling their weight. G tier for Slovenia. Spain, same thing, 1.26%. Come on, but just because, they're at the other end of the European continent, you got to get on board. Right now, it's a tax haven. That's another thing that's that's somewhere that Americans are going, not spending taxes, and they're not spending on their military, which is just not great for the US. You can think about that differently as an individual, as a sovereign individual, but from the US standpoint, not a good ally. Spain, D tier for you. Panama, it is a really important place from an economic standpoint, but they've kind of let into some degree, Chinese influences to undermine some US objectives there. So we're dropping them to C tier, but it should be, a major economic driver partner to the United States. It is a key flashpoint for global trade, and we should just be as aligned as possible. I would put them C tier, but I would almost blame the United States more than Panama, because Panama is so small, it kind of has to just react to the forces that are acting upon it. And this should be a bigger focus. The United States should say, what would it take to make Panama A tier? But that's not happening from a leadership perspective right now. Thailand, C tier. They have some military cooperation. They host the Cobra Gold military exercises. They just don't have a lot of military or economic might, but they are at least geostrategically really relevant to the South China Sea. It would be a kind of a good ally to cultivate relative to some of these other folks here. India is a really, really interesting one. This might be the hardest one to place because, they're in both the BRICS with China and Russia, and they're in the Quad with the US, Japan, and Australia. So they understand counterbalancing the Indo-Pacific. They also want to be able to get access to Russian oil and sell into Chinese markets. There's no aggression towards the United States. We get lots of university students from them. They're leading, Indian Americans are leading an enormous number of domestic technology companies. So this is a really, really tricky one because I don't know, I would assume if there was aggression in Taiwan that they would support closing the Straits of Malacca and being a part of the kind of counteractions there. But I don't know. I'm just in the dark, so I have to put them at B tier. But the potential goes all the way up to S tier if all the incentives are aligned. I don't see that happening. There's a potential for A tier. It's B tier right now. Ireland, you're a tax haven with no defense spending. They're the only ones worse than Luxembourg in terms of defense spend. So just atrocious. You're E tier as well. Philippines, B tier. Extremely important geography. Right there next to Taiwan. Them and Japan are the staging areas, US military bases, a South China Sea counterbalancing. Biggest issue is economically, from an actual counterbalancing standpoint, it's more the land than their own force projection capabilities. Japan has a much more developed military, much more developed navy, all that good stuff. Philippines, it's really the bases and that kind of staging area and the integration of that partnership that brings it up to B tier. Would need to see a little bit more GDP per capita to see that continue to go up. And then finally, we've got Egypt, super politically unstable, takes a ton of money from the United States, but it's relying on Russia for food security. It takes a ton of external investment from both China and Qatar. This is another one. I don't know why I originally was thinking this is D tier. This is E tier. Egypt, E tier. We now have 3 E tiers. I'm glad we didn't just put Iceland in that bag. Egypt, you're in there too. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see the next tier list on.